Hi, my name is Shannon Carter. I'm an extension educator with Ohio State University Extension right here in Fisher County. And tonight we're going to be talking about pressure canning. Okay, today we're going to talk about how to use a pressure canner and how it's one of the ways that we can save that fresh produce from the summer and be able to enjoy it in the winter. We're going to talk about what spoils food and what food safety measures we can take to prevent that from spoiling. So again, the basics of food safety, any foods prep always starts with washing your hands thoroughly and 20-second hand wash, warm soap and water. I don't think we mentioned this last week, but you don't need antibacterial soap, just regular old soap and water. You're not trying to kill the germs on your hands, you're trying to wash them away. And that's why the length of time of 20 seconds is a good idea. And then also sanitizing your surfaces, whether it's cutting boards or utensils, just make sure you're good to go when you start. Again, if you are preserving food, it takes a lot of investment of time and energy and sometimes cost, so you want to make sure you're considering what your family will eat and what types of things you enjoy and what method of preservation you enjoy. And then also you want to be able to consume it within a year, or have lots of friends to give it to. So there's several different types of methods of food preservation. And again, canning involves both boiling water bath canning, which we discussed last week, and pressure canning, which we're talking about tonight, as well as freezing, drying, and fermentation. Some of the advantages of food preservation: you can have that fresh taste, as fresh as you like it, right from the garden with the home canned, and you have that availability year-round. And then less spoilage. You can eliminate some of those microbial hazards, and then it's convenient. You can just go down to your pantry and get a jar of something yummy, right? So there are two types of canning methods. The boiling water is for acid foods, and the pressure canner is for low acid foods, and we'll talk about that a little bit more. So in order to know which type of canning method is appropriate, you have to know whether your food is acidic or whether it's low acid. So acid foods have a pH of less than 4.6 on the acidity scale. And generally this includes all fruits, tomatoes when they have citric acid added to them, sauerkraut and fermented pickles, and then foods to which large amounts of acid are added. And then low acid would be those that have a pH greater than 4.6. Generally, this is all vegetables, meats, poultry, seafood, soups, and mixed canned foods. Even if they include some acid foods, if there's low acid in there, we also need to preserve them in a low acid method. So this is the slide last week that scared everybody. But it's such an important one. The reason that low acid foods have to be pressure canned is because of the risk of Clostridium botulinum poisoning. And there's a bacteria that causes botulism. It's actually a spore. It's a spore former. And when the conditions are not favorable for the organisms to grow, the not favorable conditions are high heat, dryness. So that's kind of the opposite of what we have with canned food. The spores also like the lack of oxygen that actually causes them to grow even more. So as we mentioned last week, water boils at what temperature? What degrees? 212. Yeah, 100 Celsius or 212 Fahrenheit. And even if you boil it all day long, it's never going to get any hotter than 212. Well, in order to kill those botulism spores, we need to reach 240 to 250 degrees Fahrenheit. So the only way to safely do that is with our pressure canner. If those spores are not destroyed, they germinate and produce a toxin in the food when it's stored on the shelf. And the food that contains the toxin may not have any visible signs of spoilage, but it can cause a very deadly type of food poisoning that usually begins 72 hours after consuming the contaminated food. And the list of symptoms can include digestive upset, blurred or double vision, difficulty swallowing or breathing, paralysis, and eventually death. But that's why we're careful to follow directions when we're pressure canning. So hopefully that hasn't scared all of you away from wanting to can. But just kind of this might also be a repeat from last week, but some of the just basic steps in the process of home canning, your food is placed in a jar, it's heated to a temperature that's going to destroy the microorganisms. It's also going to inactivate those enzymes that cause further ripening in some of our food. And then the process of canning, the air is driven from the jar, which creates a vacuum seal for those lids. When you're canning, you want to make sure that you use reputable sources. We mentioned some of these last week. One of these is from the Cooperative Extension Service in the University of Georgia, called So Easy to Preserve. That's another approved method beyond Ohio State University. Also, the Ball Blue Book. You can find these anywhere you can find canning supplies. And we also have USDA's Guide to Home Canning. And these are available for $10 this evening. I have a limited quantity up here. You can also download these off the internet. If you picked up one of those bookmarks at the back with the resources, it's on a website on the back. So you can download any of this for free. It's just a lot of paper to print out from home. We also have OhioLine, one word, .osu.edu, and that is listed there at the bottom, the last bullet point. And those are all of the fact sheets that are in the different colors that you received this evening or that were on the back table. Some of those were from last week, but I wanted to make them available for everybody. So those, again, you can, if you have access to the internet, you can print any of those for free. You can also give me a call and I can mail them to you. Some unsafe methods of canning. We still get questions sometimes on some of these, and these are methods that have been used in the past and at the time may have been considered safe because that was the best we knew about science. And I was even thinking, since we met last week, my grandmother actually was an extension agent in Holmes County in 1930s and 40s, and she probably taught some of these methods because that's what was considered safe at the time. But even in her 80s, she was still always wanting to know what was the latest, so she had that in her. So open kettle is when you just put hot food in a jar. There's no sterilizing or boiling done of the jar after that, and the heat is enough to create a seal. Some other methods that are unsafe: canning in the oven, the microwave, the dishwasher, the old-fashioned jars with the zinc lids. Those are no longer recommended. Also, the glass jars that have those big dome lids and the wire bail or handle. Those are also, they're pretty to look at. You can put your pasta in them, but you don't want to can in those. Some equipment that you needed for pressure canning is very similar to what you need for water bath canning. You need jars and lids. This is a quart-sized jar and a pint-sized jar. And they come in, this is the regular diameter lid. They also come in the wide mouth. And then if you're doing jams or jellies, the half pint size is typical for those. You also need a canning rack, and all canners should come with these, but it keeps the food up off the bottom, or the jars up off the bottom of the pot, so they're not sitting directly on that surface. And a jar lifter so that you don't burn yourself when you're taking the hot jars out. And there's some other gadgets, but not all of them are necessary. So some of the steps to keep in mind with preparing your jars and lids is that you want to wash your jars. If they're chipped or nicked, you don't want to use them. If they're really old, like older than 18 years, or if you know that they're older than 18 years, it's probably time to get some new ones. And then you always prepare your two-piece lids. And again, the two pieces are the sealing disc and the screw band lid. You prepare these according to the directions on the box. So whatever your directions say. The screw bands are reusable, but the two-piece, the sealing disc, is a one-use only. So if it's been used, you need to get a new. But you can get small, I think they're like $2.50 a dozen, something like that. Once the food is in the jar, you want to remove the air bubbles, and you want to use a plastic knife and not a metal one because you don't want to nick your jars, which can lead to their downfall or maybe even breakage. And then once the food's in the jar, you're going to wipe the rims with a wet, clean cloth. Adjusting the two-piece lids to finger tight. One of the mistakes that people sometimes make is having their screw bands too tight. If they are too tight, you're actually going to inhibit the sealing rather than helping it. So what the recommendation is to go to the first resistance on your screw band and then go 1 inch past that. The canning jars, you want to make sure that you're using a jar, a mason type jar that's approved for canning. You don't want to use a mayonnaise jar or old pickle jar or something that's what they call a one-trip jar. Those commercially canned jars are only meant for one trip through pressure canning, and they're not. They don't have the integrity that these heavy canning jars do. We'll talk a little bit about the methods of packing, and this will vary according to recipe and your personal preferences. Raw packing is when raw food is added directly to the jar and then boiling hot liquid is poured over it. Then hot packing is where the food is already cooked in a hot liquid, so you're putting in the hot food, the hot cooking liquid is also poured over it. The differences between the two, if you're packing raw vegetables, they tend to float a little bit. These were raw packed, and I don't know who in their right mind would pressure can processed carrots, baby carrots. But we did this at our canning in service at OSU just to have a quick way to practice on the canning. But the raw food tends to float more, so if you wonder why some of your foods are floating. And then if the food is already cooked, you can actually put more food into the jar and less food is needed because it condenses as it cooks. Headspace is the amount of space in the top of the jar, between the top of the jar and where the liquid or the food starts. And that's going to vary again according to recipe. It's usually about 1 inch to 1 1/4 inches for low acid foods. Once the water gets up to boiling, you want to vent all of the steam and extra air out of the pressure canner. So if you want to, just in small groups, go back there and look, but what you're going to see is a steady stream of steam coming out of the vent port in the canner in there. So feel free to go take a look. Some of the basic parts of a pressure canner that you will see in one way or another in all canners is a flat rack in the bottom, and again, this is to keep the jars from sitting directly on the surface of the metal. And this one actually has two. What do you suppose that's for?
Second tier.
Yes, you can have a two layers of pint-sized jars. Okay, and then there's also a pressure regulator, and that is this is also called a weighted gauge. It's got 3 different settings on it: 5, 10, or 15 pounds, depending on which way you put it. And it's marked clearly which way that is. So this would be 15 pounds. So that's your pressure regulator or weighted gauge. This is the dial gauge, where it has the dial that goes around. There's also a vent pipe for pressurizing, which is what you saw the steam shooting out of in there. It's the same thing on this one. This is the vent pipe. It's also called a vent port or a petcock. There are safety valves or overpressure plugs that if too much pressure is built up, they will shoot out and basically let steam out so that you don't have an exploding canner. And it's important that those remain flexible, and if there are rubber, some of them are a harder plastic that just pops up, but this type, you can, if you want to come up later and push on it, is actually it's rubber, so that needs to remain flexible. If you find that it's brittle, then it's time to replace it. And that's something that I can do also for you is check on those. There are safety locks on some models that happen when it's pressurized. I don't see that on this one. The one in there has a safety lock underneath the handle. Then once it gets up to pressure, it trips this little lock that goes down into the handle once it's fully pressurized, and it will not allow you to open the canner until that pressure comes down. So it's a safety feature, so you're not trying to open it with too much steam coming. Another thing to look at is your sealing surface. It's either going to be metal to metal, like this one, and this one has wing nuts to seal it, or in the case of this other one, has a sealing gasket, which is a rubber ring inside.
That could potentially go back too, right?
Yes, these can get brittle, and one of the things that you can do, or if you want to bring it in and I check for you, you bend it over your finger, and if you see cracks in it or nicks in it, then it's time to replace them. And often they come in a package with the safety plug, so the two of them will come together. And it's a good idea to replace your safety plug same time you replace your ring, or every 2 to 3 years. So if it's been a while, probably want to get a new one. These are the two main canner styles that you will see. And thank you to Crystal for bringing in both of her shiny new canners that I said, oh, those are exactly like the ones on my picture. This is the All-American, and this is the kind that has the metal-to-metal sealing surface, and with these wing nuts that are also easy to, plastic handles on them, easy to do. This one has the dual gauge system. It has the weighted gauge with 5, 10, 15 pounds, and also the dial gauge. It's very heavy, isn't it?
Yeah, it's very heavy.
Very heavy. This one is a Presto brand, and it has just the dial gauge, and this other, the vent pipe gets covered later by a pressure regulator. So it's no gauge to this one, no weighted gauge on that one. Now some models will have 3 of these, one for 5, one for 10, one for 15 pounds. So that then does become another type of way to measure your pressure. And then again, like we said, this one has the sealing disc inside the gasket. So this one in reviews has been reported as being very easy to use, easy to move because it's not quite as heavy. We've kind of gone over most of these parts and pieces, but it's kind of neat to see it there and where you can see also on the inside. This will show you this vent cover lock that's actually underneath the handle of one of them. Once that pressure goes up, there's a lock that will not allow the lid to open until the pressure comes down. If this is the first time you're using your pressure canner, some of the parts might need assembled. You might need to screw in, like on this one, the safety valve. It's a good idea to use thread tape or pipe tape, Teflon tape. It seals it and it protects your threads on your dial gauge so it doesn't strip. And if you use it long enough, sometimes it actually welds the dial gauge to the lid. But you can just get Teflon tape. It's about $1 at the hardware store, unless your instructions tell you otherwise. It's always a good idea to follow your manufacturer's instructions on that anytime you are especially if it's your first time using that. So you want to become familiar with your canner. This is our ancient warranty, our booklet on our pressure cooker that we have here. So you also want to remove any manufacturing oils, wash everything with warm soapy water. There's parts are usually pre-lubricated, and I felt some on that, I don't know. Another thing you want to do before each use, I'm going to use this one because it's lighter. You want to, this is every season, I guess, when you go to use it, you want to hold up and look through this vent pipe or vent port so that you can see light through it and make sure that it's clear, because that's where the steam needs to escape when you're pressurizing. So if that is not clear, you can use a pipe cleaner to clean that out. You don't want to use anything that would leave lint, or maybe get like a toothpick might break off in there. You don't want to use that. So pipe cleaners are good for that. Just a note on smooth top ranges. We mentioned last week that you need to check your manufacturer's book on your range to know if it's recommended to can on your range. And water bath is probably a little bit easier to get away with than pressure canning. You need that steady source of heat. So hers says, when canning for long periods, alternate the use of surface cooking areas, elements, or surface burners between batches. That allows time for the most recently used areas to cool. Then you center the canner on the grate or the largest surface cooking area or element. So if you've got several sizes of burners, you want to put it on the largest one. And the canners should not exceed more than 1 inch outside the cooking area. Now on my burner, I think it's an 8-inch burner, so that pretty much eliminates my stove from most canners. These are probably at least 12 inches in diameter. Do not place canner onto 2 surface cooking areas, elements or surface burners at the same time. Okay, now what you're hearing in there is the jiggle of the weighted gauge. it's starting to get up to pressure. I put it on 10 pounds of pressure. And you want it to jiggle between 1 and 4 times a minute. 4 times a minute, I think, for vegetables. So just go for 4 times a minute. So each kind of set of jiggles, I kind of call one jiggle. It's sounding like it's jiggling pretty fast, so I'm going to turn the temperature down just a little bit, and that's kind of what you have to do on yours, is just to regulate it to get the right amount. It's a good idea to practice this. Do a dry run with your pressure canner without any food in it. You know, because my canner in there has no food in it. I just put 3-4 inches of water because I knew it was going to be boiling for a while, and so we could practice the venting and listen to the jiggle. So let's see. On coil element models, the installation of a canning unit kit is recommended. If a kit is not installed, the life of the coil element will be shortened. So. And for more information, contact your extension office. What we're going to talk about are some of the processes involved, but we're still not getting to the steps 1, 2, 3. So I'll tell you when we get to those. But as the water boils in the canner, the empty space between the water and the lid becomes a mixture of steam and air, and that mixture is. The temperature of that is lower than the temperature of pure steam, so you want to get that air out. And that's what you do, is venting. When you're venting or you're exhausting the air so that the processing takes place in a pure steam environment. So, let's see. So here's your instructions on how to vent your canner. The steam has to flow freely from the open vent port in the lid. So you want to take off your pressure regulators so that the steam can come out those. Of course, I promise I'll put your gauge back on. Okay. So then after you put filled jars in the canner, you fasten the lid with whatever method your canner has and leave that vent port open. Put it on it's already on the burner. You turn the heat on high, and when the water boils, steam will start to come out of the open vent. And it might take, up to 20, 30 minutes to get a good stream of, I think mine was at least 20 this evening before we heard that hiss. So that's when you know you've got that steady stream of air. Once there's a constant, strong funnel of steam, then you can start your timer for 10 minutes. And you want to let that steam go for 10 minutes. And at the end of the 10 minutes, you place the weight on the vent port for whatever weight you're processing. Or if it's just the pressure regulator without the weight, you just put that on there. If you don't pressurize your canner or exhaust your canner first, you run the risk of your jars not sealing because, again, the temperature in here is lower if it's still got some water in it than if it's pure steam. So now we come down to our pressure canner processing steps. And so the first thing you want to do is have 2 to 3 inches of water in your canner. You're going to have your canner on your burner. The burner's off. 2 to 3 inches of water. You place the jars on the rack in your canner. And whatever method of packing you decided to do, whether it's hot pack or raw pack, so you're placing your jars down. Okay, and they all have to be the same size. You can't do mixed because this might be under process. The larger might be under process. So you've got all your jars in there. We'll pretend this is full. All right, and then you put your lid on the canner with the vent port open. So you've got your gauge here, and you've got your pressure regulator off. You're going to turn it on high. Once you get the steady stream of steam, you're going to vent it for 10 minutes to fully exhaust your canner. Then you close the vent port, whether it's with this or over there. It's going to be with your. And then you have to regulate your heat to maintain a steady pressure, and that's what we're doing in there with the jiggle. Adjust your pressure for altitude if needed. Now at the end of your processing time, let's say your recipe says to process at 5 pounds of pressure for 10 minutes. So you set your, you do not begin your processing time until you're happy with the jiggle. You don't want to start the processing time until you hear that first jiggle. So that's when you can set your time for whatever your recipe says. And at the end of the processing time, you turn off the heat and don't touch it. You want to let the pressure drop to 0 pressure naturally. You don't want to run it under cold water. You don't want to jiggle this and let the steam shoot. Just kind of leave it alone. And then once that pressure drops all the way down, this is where the dial gauges are helpful because you can watch the pressure drop. The weighted gauge, once it stops jiggling, you know you're in the right direction, that the pressure is dropping. You can take a fork and nudge it a little bit, and if you don't, if you hear that hiss, then back off and let it go a little bit longer. But if you nudge it a little bit and you don't hear the hiss, you might be safe to, with a hot pad, remove your weighted gauge. And then opening your canner carefully because you're still going to be having lots of steam in there. And you always want to open the lid away from you so that the steam, if there is any, will go away from your face. And then you're going to cool your jars, removing them with your jar lifter. You're going to put them on a padded surface or a rack because you don't want them to be bumped or shocked onto a cold surface. So you have maybe some folded towels or a cooling rack that they could cool on for 12 to 24 hours undisturbed. So also not in a draft or in the way of a fan. And then at the end of the 24 hours, you want to check that your jars have sealed. And you do that just by pushing down on the lid. And you can tell this one's not sealed because it bounces back at you. These are sealed. Once they have sealed and cooled after that 24 hours, you can take the screw bands off of them. It's actually recommended that you do, and then wipe the surface if there's any food that came out during the processing time, and store them without the screw bands on. This slide is showing you again opening the canner lid tilted away from you. Everything in that canner is still very hot. Then when you store your home canned food, you want to label and date all of the jars with what's in them and when they were processed. Store them in a cool, dry, dark place. Avoid temperature extremes. Some pantries are right next to the stove or maybe a furnace pipe or something. If you can locate your pantry where it doesn't have fluctuation in heat, that's helpful. And then use them within 1 year for best quality. They might still be safe longer than that, but they'll start to lose their quality more rapidly after 1 year. Here's some information on storing your canner. You want to thoroughly dry your canner, your lid, and your gasket. Clean the vent openings if necessary by running that pipe cleaner. Or you can run a thin strip of cloth through them. And you want to store your canner, this part's not on there, but you want to take the rubber gasket out of the lid. You don't want to store it in the lid because it can trap water or moisture. So you want to take the rubber gasket out, make sure it's thoroughly dry, and store it in the bottom of your canner. And then put crumpled paper towels or newspaper in the bottom of it just to help absorb some extra moisture. And then you can also wrap the lid in paper and just store it upside down in your canner. As far as Vaseline, you can do that with, especially I think metal to metal surfaces might tend to have more issues with that. Not so much this one because it doesn't have to slide a lot. You've got the wing nuts on that one. But is that something that someone does regularly with their gasket and has good turnout with that? Yeah, I was going to say cooking oil might be, yeah, if you spit, sounds like something edible, right? There are a couple slides that we skipped past quickly so that we could get to our canner in the kitchen, and one of those is your processing times. And this would be a good time to pull out one of your fact sheets. The gold one has recipes in the back of not so much recipes but steps to do when you're processing vegetables. So if you want to can asparagus, it will tell you, okay, wash, trim them, and then what the steps are. Okay, so that's where you get your processing times and pounds for, and those are not a time to experiment with recipes. You kind of have to follow exactly what is on there because the process times are affected by how acidic the food is, what was your preparation style, what's the composition of the food, and then the temperature of the food when it was jarred. Is it raw or hot? the processing temperature, as well as the size and shape of your jar. Some of those newer jars, someone mentioned last week, the really short ones that have the really wide mouth. Okay, if you look on page 3, at the top on the right, this is the pressure that you're going to need to use in order to reach 240 degrees. In general, 5 pounds of pressure equals 220 degrees, 10 pounds equals 240, and 15 pounds equals 260. 5 pounds equals 220. 10 pounds equals 240, and 15 pounds equals 260 degrees. Now, if you have both a dial gauge and a weight, like if you have a dual gauge canner, you can use both. It's kind of nice to have a double check. These will never go bad. They'll never get out of. They never need to be rechecked, or unless it's damaged somehow. The dial gauges do need to be checked for accuracy every year that you use them. That's something that I can do at the Extension office. I offer that for free, at least currently. Thank you to the county commissioners, so thank them. And I have a master gauge that I get checked annually by the company that I can compare to yours and make sure that it's accurate. And I called one of the companies, and they even said if your dial gauge is off by more than 2 pounds, to ignore it and just use your weighted gauge if you have the dual gauge system. But some people, they like that kind of as a double check. Now, one thing I did want to mention, even when you're pressure canning, which is what we learned last week, even whether you're pressure or water bath canning, you need to acidify your tomatoes. And that's because growers have bred the acid out of tomatoes. They're with all the hybrid varieties. And that's so it's easier for consumers to eat, but it poses a problem when we're canning. So we have to add acid you can get powdered citric acid or bottled lemon juice is probably the most preferred method. The citric acid does not change the flavor at all. Lemon juice changes it slightly. Some people prefer to add just a hint of sugar with that, and you can do that. You can add sugar to tomatoes without throwing off the recipe. You can also use vinegar, but that definitely changes the flavor. So any of your approved recipes will also give you the amounts of acid to add, and you want to add that directly to the jar, the empty jar, the clean, sterilized empty jar, before you add your tomato products on top of it. Just because it seals doesn't mean it's safe. Adding acid to tomatoes helps to preserve them and helps to minimize the spoilage and the growth of microorganisms. So it is part of the safety process of tomatoes. And then so again, following directions exactly is important. It's not a good time to experiment with flavors because adding extra sugar or fat can throw off the acidity of the food. Salt is something you can change a little bit with, because that's usually to taste, and a lot of people like to home can their foods because they don't add the salt, or they wait and add the salt when they consume it. Even cutting your pieces larger than what the recipe, if it says 1-inch chunks, you better not go any bigger than 1 inch, because that's they're giving you the length of time that it would take for the heat to penetrate all the way through that chunk of food. Or adding thickeners like rice or noodles would throw off the recipe a little bit too. So if your jars do not seal, you can reprocess them if it's within 24 hours. So again, you're checking those seals, and if you find one that is not sealed, you can do several things. You can eat it. You can put it in your refrigerator for a few days. You could put it in a freezer container and freeze it, or you could reprocess it, which would be starting over with a new 2-piece lid, new sealing disc, and then from that point forward, you would have to put it in your canner and heat that up all over again. So that food might be cooked 4 times by the time you consume it. If any of you have a canner dial gauge that you would like tested but you did not bring it tonight, you're welcome to drop it off here at the office. Our suite is Suite D. It's down to the left on the front side of the building. We're open Monday through Friday, 7:30 to 4, and you're welcome to leave it. And then I work part-time, so I'm not in every day, but I will test it as soon as I can and then get that back to you. We'll call you when it's ready, usually within a couple days, and it's a free service. You don't have to bring the whole canner because the sealing is, the only thing to check really on the canner itself are your handles on tightly, which is something you can do, and most of them are with the screwdriver. You can tighten them that way. If you are in the middle of a recipe and something's not going right, and our office isn't open or I'm not here, I want to make sure you have this resource. It is on your little strip. It looks like a bookmark on the top, but on the back side there are, yes, thank you, she's holding it up for us. There are websites on the back, and the Home Food Preservation has a website that has troubleshooting on it. This is what their homepage looks like, the National Center for Home Food Preservation. And under the How Do I section, How Do I Can, you can click on that and you can get general information, step-by-step processes. You can also look for frequently asked questions up here in the first section up here at the top. And chances are, if something doesn't go right for you, it's happened to someone else as well. And so the first one here is, can foods be recanned if the lid does not seal? If it's discovered within 24 hours, so to recan, you remove the lid, check the jar sealing surface for any tiny nicks to make sure that wasn't the reason. And if it is, you can get it a new clean jar. Then add a new lid to it and reprocess. So yeah, like I said, just about any question that you can think of, why something didn't work. If you want to, do something differently the next time, the answer is probably there. I mentioned this last week. A lot of people like to use Grandma's recipe, and my recommendation is to frame it and put it on the wall, but not use it. And it's not Grandma's fault, but things are different now. Our vinegar is also less acidic. So what worked in Grandma's time may not. It's just our food is different now. All right. Well, I want to thank you all for coming this evening. If you have more questions, I will be around. I'll be here testing canners. If you would like to purchase a home guide to canning, you're welcome to do that. And I would like to again thank you all for coming. And I will, if you've marked that you'd like to receive information about future classes, I'll be sure and do that. And whether you have email or mailing address. So, happy canning.
Thank you.